I hadn't planned on taking that back road, not really. It was the kind of night where the moon barely cuts through the clouds, and the woods press in close, almost daring you to drive a little slower, to see what lingers in the shadows. I was heading home from a late-night job, the highway empty, the hum of my tires the only sound cutting through the dark. Then a turnoff caught my eye, a thin gravel path lined with pines that swayed like they were leaning in to whisper secrets to each other. Something drew me in, curiosity, I guess, or maybe that itch for the kind of stories that make the hair stand up on the back of your neck. I drove down the path until it ended in a small clearing. There it was, a cabin, so small and decrepit I wondered if it had survived more winters than anyone alive could remember. The wood was gray and rotten, the roof sagging, shingles missing like teeth in a crooked smile. I parked on the soft dirt and stepped out, the air heavy with the scent of pine, damp earth, and something older, something that made my stomach twist. The cabin's door hung slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. I hesitated, my instincts telling me to turn back, but I pushed it open. The interior was darker than I expected, almost chokingly so. The air smelled of decay and dust, like it hadn't been breathed in for years. My boots pressed into the floorboards, and they groaned under me, every step announcing my presence to the empty space. In the far corner, a bed sat crooked, a tangle of old blankets and sheets strewn across it. It looked like someone had been there recently, like they had run out the door and left everything behind. My heart thudded. I wasn't supposed to be here, and yet I couldn't bring myself to leave. On a splintered table near the wall, I spotted a journal. Its leather cover was cracked, brittle, and yellowed, the kind of thing you handle with gloves if you know what's good for it. I knelt down and flipped it open. The handwriting was delicate at first, almost careful, but with every entry it grew shaky, uneven, desperate. The words told a story of hiding, of someone, a woman, fleeing through these same woods, trying to escape something she never named. She wrote about nights spent shivering in the cabin, about footsteps outside her window, about shadows that didn't belong to trees. Each page became darker, her language more frantic. And then I reached the last page. The words stopped halfway down, smeared with a dark, almost wet stain. I couldn't tell if it was ink or something else. My stomach turned. I froze. That's when I realized the air felt heavier, charged. I wasn't alone. I didn't see anyone, but I felt it, the eyes. Somewhere in the corners of the room, maybe outside the broken windows, someone was watching. I thought I heard a whisper, soft, almost like a breath in my ear. I turned quickly, but the cabin was empty. I could hear it again, this time more insistent, like someone pacing behind the walls. My chest tightened, my hand shaking. I grabbed the journal and bolted for the door. It slammed behind me, the wind or something else, I couldn't tell. I ran to my car, scrambling in the dirt as branches tore at my jacket and face. I started the engine, my hands slick on the wheel, and drove down the path faster than I ever had, never looking back. The road back to the highway seemed endless. The pines leaned in closer, the wind whipping through them carrying faint whispers, almost voices, just beyond comprehension. My headlights caught glimpses of shapes flitting between the trees. Too quick to be deer, too silent to be normal. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum, every instinct screaming that I had crossed into something I wasn't supposed to see. I reached the highway eventually, the open road a relief, the lights of town just peeking through the horizon, but the feeling didn't leave me. That night, and for many nights after, I kept replaying the cabin in my mind. The smell of decay, the tangle of blankets, the journal's dark smear. It clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. Months passed, but I couldn't tell anyone what I had seen. People wouldn't believe me. They'd call it imagination, exhaustion, or overactive curiosity. But I know what I felt. I can't explain the whispering, the sensation of eyes on my back, or the way the cabin seemed almost alive in its decay, waiting. I've thought about going back, trying to find it again, but the thought of those walls closing in, of those unseen eyes, keeps me away. Even now, years later, the memory is vivid. When I drive past darkened woods or hear the whisper of the wind through pines, I feel it, the same gaze from Widow's Creek, watching, waiting. I try to tell myself it was just an old cabin, abandoned and forgotten. But I know better. I know something followed me that night, and I don't think it ever stopped. Even now, I catch myself glancing at the shadows, at every movement just beyond my vision. The memory gnaws at the edges of my mind. A cabin that should not exist, a woman's desperate scribbles, and the whisper of something unseen. It is not just memory. It is a presence, one that has attached itself to me in ways I cannot fully understand. Sleep is uneasy, and even in daylight, the feeling lingers. I am never truly alone. Something waits just beyond the tree line, where Widow's Creek winds through the forest, patient, silent, and watching. I tell myself to forget it, to move on, but the journal's pages, smudged with that dark stain, haunt me. They are proof that I was there, that I saw what was not meant to be seen, and that some things in these woods refuse to remain hidden forever. I will never go back. I cannot. But I carry it with me, a quiet dread that flares when a wind shifts and the pines whisper, a reminder that what hides in the shadows of Appalachia does not always stay in the past. I had been hiking through the outskirts of that forgotten town for hours, the kind of place where the map barely exists and the trees press in close, darkening the trails even at midday. I was alone, carrying just a backpack, my water bottle sloshing with every step, and a sense of curiosity that had been gnawing at me for weeks. People in the nearby towns had warned me, quietly, about wandering too far into the abandoned sections, muttering about old houses, derelict barns, and the kind of quiet that feels alive, but I brushed it off. I thought the stories were just that, stories. That is, until I stumbled upon the smokehouse. It sat behind what used to be a farmhouse, or what I assumed had once been one. The structure was small, squat, leaning slightly to one side, its door hanging crooked as though it had been battered open and never repaired. The wood had faded to a dull gray, streaked with black mold and age. I hesitated for a moment before stepping closer, the hairs on my neck rising, a small warning in the pit of my stomach I couldn't quite name. I reached for the door and pushed it open. The smell hit me before anything else. Rot, dampness, and the sharp tang of something I couldn't identify. It was the kind of smell that sticks in your nose and throat, the kind that makes you cough and wonder if you've stepped into decay itself. Inside, the shelves that had once held jars of smoked meat or pickled vegetables were a disaster. Glass shards glittered in the dim light as though catching the shadows themselves, and a thick, dark liquid pooled on the floor beneath. I stepped cautiously over it, boots sticking slightly to the ooze, and my eyes widened when I noticed footprints in the dust. Fresh footprints. And they weren't mine. They moved across the room to the side, and then disappeared under a shelf, only to reappear again near the doorway, looping in a way that didn't make sense. My heart began to pound, a steady thrum that echoed the uncertainty in the room. I told myself it was probably another hiker, or maybe a local checking the place, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the corners seemed to gather, like they were alive and watching. Then I heard it. A whisper, almost imperceptible, barely more than the rustle of clothing against itself, but clear enough to freeze me in place. "Hey!" It seemed to say, soft and drawn out. I spun, but the room was empty. I swallowed hard and tried to calm my breathing, telling myself I was imagining things. But the whisper came again, this time a little closer, a little sharper, like someone was speaking my name from just beyond the doorway. My hands trembled as I followed the footprints, my curiosity mixed with dread. They led me out of the smokehouse and into the open yard behind the old farmhouse, where the skeletal remains of a barn had collapsed under decades of neglect. The ground was littered with old tools, rusted rakes, a shovel bent in the middle, hammers cracked with age. Something had clearly happened here long ago, and the scene looked like a struggle had taken place. I could almost imagine the people who had lived here trying to survive, their panic frozen in the dust and broken wood around me. Then movement caught my eye. A shadow flicked across the doorway of the barn, quick and silent. I froze, expecting someone to step out to call my name, but nothing came. My pulse raced. I felt a pressure on my back like the air itself was closing in, and I knew I needed to get out of there. I ran. Branches whipped my face, snagging my jacket, and my boots slipped on the wet, mossy earth. Behind me, the whispering seemed to follow, impossible to locate, yet undeniably there. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sounded amplified, like the forest itself had leaned closer to watch me flee. I didn't stop until I reached the main path, lungs burning, heart hammering. I looked back, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure, lean and distorted, standing near the ruins of the barn. Then it vanished, absorbed by the woods as if it had never existed. Months later, I returned with a couple of friends, eager to show them the smokehouse, to prove that I hadn't imagined everything. We hiked the trail, laughing at first, joking about the creepy stories that had haunted my mind. But when we reached the clearing, the smokehouse was gone. The barn ruins were just as they had always been, but the little building I had explored, with its broken shelves and dark pools of liquid, was nowhere to be found. We searched the surrounding woods, scanning undergrowth and fallen trees, but it had been swallowed, as if the forest itself had claimed it back, erasing any trace of its existence. Even now, years later, I can feel it. A sense of presence that lingers in quiet moments. The smell of rot when the wind shifts, the fleeting shadow of something moving just beyond sight. At night, I hear whispers in my dreams, fragments of words, a name I can almost remember, carried on the breath of the forest. The memory of the footprints, the jars, the cold, the oppressive air, it doesn't fade. I tell myself it was a trick of the mind, a product of isolation and imagination, but deep down, I know what I experienced was real. Something inhabits those woods, something patient, quiet, and unyielding. And sometimes, when I walk near the old trails or hear the creek babbling through the mountains, I swear I can feel its gaze, watching, waiting, as though the forest remembers me and will never forget. I haven't gone back. I never will. The smokehouse may have vanished physically, but it lives in my mind, in every creak of a floorboard, in the rustle of leaves, in the cold draft that slips through an open door. It lingers in the spaces where the trees grow thick, where the forest swallows the light, and where something unseen waits for the next curious soul to wander too far off the path. And I wonder sometimes if those footprints I saw weren't mine at all, but a reminder that whatever hides in these mountains isn't just a memory. It's patient still, and maybe, just maybe, it followed me out. I had been driving along the winding roads of Miller's Hill for hours, the kind of roads where every turn seems to lead deeper into the woods and the air grows heavier with each passing mile. Locals had warned me not to go up there after dark, murmuring about the cabins and the people who vanished, about whispers in the trees and shadows that didn't belong to the forest. I had laughed it off at first. Curiosity, I told myself, nothing more. But the more I drove, the more I felt a tension building in my chest, a subtle pressure that made the hair on my arms stand up. The sun was already low, brushing the sky with orange and violet streaks, when I finally reached the summit. That's when I saw it. A cabin, alone and crumbling, nestled between the jagged pines and the rocky outcroppings of the hill. Its windows were cracked, the paint peeled like sunburned skin, and the door sagged on its hinges as if the building itself were too tired to stand straight. I hesitated at the threshold, taking in the smell of wet earth and decay that clung to the cabin like a thick fog. The scent was stronger than anything I'd ever encountered in the woods, damp and organic, carrying the taste of rot and something older, something not quite natural. I stepped inside carefully, boots pressing into the warped floorboards, each creak echoing in the empty space. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and I noticed the walls, symbols etched into the beams, crude at first glance, but there was a rhythm to them, a repetition that made my stomach knot. At first, I thought they were graffiti, perhaps left by some local kids or vandals, but the patterns continued on every wall, crossing into corners and wrapping around support posts. There was an intention to them, a message I couldn't decipher, and it unsettled me more than I could explain. I moved slowly, running my hands along the walls, the texture of the carvings rough beneath my fingers. The air inside grew colder, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones, making them ache as though the house itself were breathing down my neck. I could hear the faintest tremble underfoot, almost like the floor was responding to my presence. Dusk fell outside, shadows stretching long and dark, and I felt the weight of the cabin settle around me. That's when I saw it, a figure in the corner. Pale, silent, just standing there watching. I froze. My mind raced, telling me it couldn't be real, but every instinct screamed otherwise. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even seem to breathe. It was just there, observing, its presence so oppressive that it pressed on my chest with every heartbeat. I stumbled back, barely able to hold my balance, and the floor shivered again beneath me, subtle but undeniable. I didn't wait to process what I was seeing. I bolted toward the door, my boots thumping against the warped boards, the symbols on the walls seeming to ripple in the failing light. Branches clawed at my clothes as I burst into the trees surrounding the cabin, and I didn't dare look back. My heart pounded so violently I thought it might burst, and my lungs burned with every frantic step. The forest swallowed me, the trees closing in, their gnarled roots tripping me as if the hill itself were determined to keep me there. I ran without direction, following instinct alone, until the oppressive presence of the cabin faded behind me, or so I thought. Later, when I gathered the courage to tell someone, the locals' expressions changed. They didn't ask how I got up there or what I saw, they just shook their heads and muttered that Miller's Hill had always claimed its own, that cabins like the one I saw weren't abandoned for nothing, and that the hill was older than the town itself, older than anyone could remember. They told me about the disappearances, about hikers and hunters who vanished without a trace, about families who left one day and never returned. The cabin I had fled from had been empty for decades, they said. It shouldn't have been there at all. The memory of that evening stays with me. Even now, I can feel it. The smell of wet wood, the chill in the air, the tremor of the floor underfoot. I think of the figure in the corner, so impossibly still, watching me, and I wonder who, or what had lingered there for so long. I replay the carvings on the walls, the rhythmic repetition of those symbols, and I can't shake the feeling that they were meant for someone like me, a warning I ignored until it was too late. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, I hear the floorboards creak under invisible weight, or the whisper of something brushing past the edges of my vision, and I remember that hill. Miller's Hill waits, patient and silent, holding its secrets, and I know that the cabin will always exist somewhere on its summit, unseen yet very much alive in the mind of anyone who dares to approach. I haven't returned. I will never return. But the memory doesn't let me go. The figure, the chill, the symbols, they are stitched into my mind, a constant presence that flares whenever I drive past a ridge, or hear the wind shift through the pines. Miller's Hill is not just a place, it is a living history of fear, a quiet reminder that the forest remembers, that the cabins remember, and that some things in the Appalachian woods are patient enough to outlast any lifetime. The hollow cabin watches still, waiting for the next person to wander too close, and I carry the memory of that encounter as both warning and curse. The dread lingers, persistent and subtle, a shadow I cannot outrun, a presence that follows me long after the hill has faded from view, whispering reminders that some doors, once opened, are never truly closed. I had been driving through Pine Hollow later than I intended, the roads twisting like old scars through the mountains, the headlights barely cutting through the thick night. The town had long since faded behind me, and the road narrowed into something closer to a path, flanked on both sides by dark pines that swayed like silent sentinels. The air was cool and heavy, carrying the faint scent of moss and wet earth, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, the solitude of the road pressing in on me. I wasn't scared, at least I told myself I wasn't, but there was a weight to the night, a kind of stillness that made even the sound of the engine seem too loud. That's when I saw it, a cabin bathed in pale moonlight, standing alone in a small clearing. Its windows flickered, though there was no electricity to speak of, and the shadows it cast were long and irregular, stretching into the trees like black fingers. Curiosity drew me closer, though some small, rational part of me whispered to keep driving. As I pulled up, I noticed a rocking chair moving slowly on the porch, its rhythmic creak echoing in the stillness. No one was there. Not a single person, not a sound of movement beyond the chair itself. My pulse quickened, and I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching sharply under my boots. The air around the cabin was heavier than the surrounding forest, thick, almost suffocating. I hesitated at the threshold, glancing back at the road I'd come from, wondering if I should turn and go. But something, call it curiosity, or maybe something older and more insistent, drew me forward. I pushed open the door. The smell inside hit me instantly. Damp wood, rot, and the faint, sour tang of something decayed and forgotten. The floorboards groaned under invisible footsteps, as though the cabin itself was shifting, adjusting to my presence. I stepped carefully, each creak of the wood magnifying the oppressive silence. And then I heard it, whispers low and melodic, drifting through the room as though carried by the walls themselves. My name, or something like it, repeated softly, impossibly, and I froze. The voice was neither threatening nor kind, It was something in between, familiar and alien all at once, winding through the air like smoke. I told myself it was the wind, playing tricks through the broken windows, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent, circling me. I turned, trying to locate their source, but the room seemed empty. Shadows shifted along the walls, dancing just beyond the edge of vision. The rocking chair had stopped, yet the movement lingered in the corner of my eye. Panic started to rise, a cold, tightening knot in my chest. I reached for the door, and just as my fingers touched the handle, it slammed shut behind me. The cabin's interior went completely dark for a moment, and I stumbled, tripping over the uneven floor. The whispers swelled, filling the space, overlapping, coming from every direction at once. I pressed my palms against my ears, but it did no good. The voices were inside me as much as around me, pulling at my mind, teasing my senses. I forced myself to stand, heart hammering, hands shaking, and back toward the door. My foot caught on a loose floorboard, sending me sprawling, and the whispers intensified, layering into a chorus of soft melodic calls. They were beckoning, urging me forward, and I could feel the air thickening, pressing down like wet cloth. With a surge of fear, I kicked the door with every ounce of strength I had. It gave way with a loud crash, and I bolted into the night, the smell of the cabin following me into the woods. The rocking chair's creak, impossibly slow and persistent, echoed behind me, though I didn't dare look back. Branches tore at my clothes, and my boots sank into the soft earth as I ran blindly, guided only by instinct and moonlight. The whispers faded slowly, but never completely, lingering in the rustle of leaves, the snapping of twigs beneath my feet. I stumbled onto the road eventually, lungs burning, chest heaving, and looked back. There was nothing. No cabin, no rocking chair, just the dark outline of the trees swaying in the night breeze. I returned home that night with my nerves frayed, my mind reeling, but telling myself it had been a trick of the light, a combination of exhaustion and isolation. Months passed, and I went back cautiously, hoping to find evidence, a rational explanation, anything to quiet the memory. The clearing was empty. No cabin, no shadows, no faint flicker of moonlight catching on cracked windows. The place where the cabin had stood was indistinguishable from the surrounding woods, as though it had never existed. Yet the memory persisted, the scent of rot, the groan of floorboards under invisible weight, the whispers calling my name, soft and insistent, lingering in my ears long after the forest had faded behind me. At night, I hear them sometimes, carried on the wind, almost melodic, beckoning me toward places I know I should never return. Even now, I drive carefully past Pine Hollow, my eyes scanning every shadow, every clearing. I can still feel the cabin's presence in the hush of the woods, in the sway of the trees, in the wind curling around corners. The memory sits heavy in my chest, a quiet dread that flares when I least expect it, reminding me that some places in the mountains are patient, and some whispers never truly die. I've told myself it was a hallucination, a trick of the night, but deep down I know better. That cabin, and the voices that lived inside it, were real. And sometimes, in the quietest moments, when the wind shifts just right, I swear I can hear my name again, sung softly from a place that shouldn't exist, somewhere deep in Pine Hollow. I was driving deeper into the mountains than I usually ever did, following a winding back road that barely showed up on the map anymore. The pavement kept breaking into gravel, and the gravel into dirt, until eventually I was sure I had taken a wrong turn somewhere. Pine needles blanketed the path so thickly it looked like the road itself had been swallowed by the forest. My phone had lost service miles back, leaving me with the uneasy feeling that I was moving deeper into someplace I wasn't meant to be. Still, something kept me going. Maybe curiosity, maybe stubbornness, maybe that strange pull the Appalachian backwoods has on people who wander too close to its forgotten places. It happened when I passed an old logging path, half collapsed and barely visible through the undergrowth. But the cabin beside it, sitting maybe 20 yards off the road, was unmistakable. Every one of its windows was shattered, not cracked, not broken by a fallen branch, shattered inward, like something had come from the outside with enough force to blow the glass straight into the rooms behind them. I slowed the car without even thinking, my eyes drawn to the dark hollows where windows should have been. Something about the place felt wrong, but in a way that only made me want to look closer. Maybe it was the way the roof sagged, or the way the trees leaned toward it, their trunks bending unnaturally as if reaching. Maybe it was the silence, because the moment I rolled to a stop on the gravel, the forest went completely still. No birds, no wind, just the low hum of my engine. I cut it off, and the silence deepened so suddenly it felt like a physical pressure pressing against my ears. I told myself I was just going to take a couple photos. That's all. I'd come this far. I might as well document it. I grabbed my camera from the passenger seat and stepped onto the dirt road. The air smelled sharp, like cold sap and old wood. As I walked toward the cabin, dead leaves crunching under my boots, the sensation of being watched crept over me, subtle at first, then stronger with each step. Up close, the cabin looked worse. The wood was grayed and splintered. The beams bowed inward like the whole structure was breathing shallowly. The front door hung crooked, one hinge straining like it would snap if I touched it. I looked through the empty window frames, expecting darkness, but instead saw a faint flicker of light moving across the far wall. My heart jumped. Just a reflection, I told myself. Maybe sunlight catching a piece of glass inside. Except the sky was heavily overcast, and I couldn't see anything reflective. Against my better judgment, I stepped onto the porch. The boards moaned beneath my weight, long, low groans that echoed under the cabin, like something was shifting there. The smell hit me then, old dust mixed with damp wood, but underneath that, something else. Something metallic and sour, like rusted nails pulled from wet lumber. I hesitated at the doorway, staring into the dark rectangle of the interior. But the curiosity that had brought me here pushed me forward. Inside, the cabin was completely empty except for a single wooden chair lying upside down in the dead center of the room. It looked deliberate, like someone had placed it exactly there and then flipped it. The air felt colder inside, not like outdoor cold but internal cold, like stepping into a freezer. I took a slow breath, trying to ignore how the air seemed to stick in my throat. Then I saw the scratches. At first I thought they were cracks in the wood, but when I stepped closer, I realized they were gouges. Deep, jagged cuts raked down the walls in uneven lines. They weren't the kind you'd see from an animal trying to get in. They were the kind of mark something would make trying to get out. Some of them were deep enough to splinter the wooden beams. Others had torn so far into the wall you could see insulation poking through. My stomach tightened as I reached out to touch one, running my fingertips slowly over the torn wood. The grooves were rough, splintered, still sharp in places, and something about the size and spacing made my skin crawl. Too wide for a person's nails. Too uneven for tools. Too controlled to be random damage. I stepped back, feeling my pulse quicken. The silence in the cabin was thick, almost syrupy, making every shallow breath sound too loud. The overturned chair lay exactly where my eyes kept returning, as if it were pointing toward something I wasn't seeing yet. The floorboards beneath it were scuffed, almost polished in patches like someone or something had circled the room again and again, pacing in frantic, restless loops. My mind raced to fill in the gaps with explanations. Maybe teenagers breaking in, maybe some wild animal thrashing around. But none of those made sense. None of them matched the feeling building in my gut. I lifted my camera and snapped a single photo. The click of the shutter echoed unnaturally through the cabin, as though it traveled farther than it should have. Then a gust of wind slammed the door behind me with such force that the whole cabin shuddered. I jumped, spinning around, heart pounding. The door was closed tight now, no breeze coming through the broken windows, yet the air stirred lightly against my neck, cool and deliberate, like breath. That's when I saw them, shadows stretching across the walls in long, unnatural smears. At first I thought they were tree branches waving outside, but the shadows weren't moving with the wind. They weren't tied to anything beyond the walls. They stretched slowly, creeping upward like fingers reaching for the ceiling, like something inside was growing taller. My breath caught in my throat. The cabin seemed to darken around me, as though the walls were closing in, absorbing the faint light from the broken windows. I backed away from the chair, my boots scraping against the floor. The shadows shifted again, this time rippling toward me, long and draped like fabric dragging across the floor. My mind scrambled for logic, but logic had no foothold here. Everything inside me screamed to run, yet my legs felt heavy, anchored by fear or pressure or something unseen. The silence broke with a soft creak, so faint I thought I imagined it. Then another. A slow, steady rhythm, coming from the far corner of the room. I turned my head mechanically, following the sound. There was nothing there. No chair. No movement. Just darkness pooling where the shadows were thickest. But the creaking continued, slow and patient, like someone shifting their weight on a loose floorboard. My chest tightened, breath turning shallow. The air around me pulsed once, cool, then colder, then freezing enough to sting my skin. Instinct kicked in stronger than fear. I lunged for the door, grabbed the handle and yanked. It didn't budge. I pulled harder, heart hammering, every muscle straining. Behind me, the quiet creaking grew louder, closer, as though something was rising from the floor and stepping toward me. A fresh series of scratches pierced the air, long, dragging, scraping down the wall behind me. With a surge of adrenaline, I slammed my shoulder into the door. It burst open so violently I nearly fell through it. I staggered out onto the porch, stumbling down the steps, my camera swinging painfully against my chest. The moment my boots hit the dirt, I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't slow down. The forest around me blurred as I tore down the road to my car, scrambling inside and fumbling with the keys. When the engine roared to life, the sound felt like oxygen. I sped down the road, gravel spitting, heart-breaking rhythm against my ribs. For the first mile, I refused to check my mirrors. When I finally dared, the cabin was out of sight, swallowed by the trees. But the sensation of being watched, of unseen eyes tracking every inch I moved, didn't fade. It grew stronger. It followed me mile after mile, sitting cold and heavy at the back of my neck. Even now, thinking back on it, I know what I felt was real. Something in that cabin was alive in a way I can't explain. Something that didn't want me there but also didn't want me to leave. I haven't been back since. I won't even drive near that logging path. But sometimes, late at night, when the house settles or the wind slips through the cracks in my window, I hear that same slow creaking from the cabin. Soft, steady, patient, like something remembering me. And sometimes, when the room is dark and the shadows stretch too far across the walls, I swear I can see them reaching again, long and deliberate, as though they've finally found a way to follow me home. I had been wandering through a section of forest that didn't appear on any of the maps I carried. The trail was little more than a rough path, tangled with roots and half covered in fallen leaves that muffled my footsteps. It was the kind of place where the air hangs heavy, and even the wind seems reluctant to stir. I was drawn deeper by curiosity, the forest thickening around me, pressing close until the sun filtered through the canopy in scattered, ghostly beams. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice whispered that I should turn back. I ignored it. I'd been exploring long enough to know that the best discoveries often came when you ignored that little voice. That was when I saw the cabin. It sat on a small rise, timber walls blackened by age or smoke. I couldn't tell which, and the roof sagged in the center like it might cave in at any moment. The forest seemed to bend around it, shadows curling and stretching toward its corners. Even from a distance, I could feel it, the kind of presence that doesn't announce itself with noise, but with pressure, like the air is just a little thicker, heavier around you. I approached slowly, the ground crunching softly beneath my boots. The smell hit me as soon as I stepped onto the porch. Wet wood, soot, and a tang of something iron-like that made my stomach churn. The door was ajar, hanging on a single hinge, and the cabin seemed to inhale as I pushed it open. Inside, it was darker than I expected, though the walls were only a few feet apart. The air smelled of rot and old pine, but beneath that, I caught something else, something faint but unmistakable, the smell of smoke, old and dry. I stepped inside carefully, boots crunching over broken boards, and I froze almost immediately. Above me, faint footsteps echoed on the upper floor, a slow, dragging rhythm. My breath caught. I remembered reading that the cabin had a collapsed second story, caved in decades ago. How could anyone or anything be up there? I held my breath listening. The sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a low creak, almost like a rocking chair moving back and forth. I spun toward the sound, and the chair in the corner of the room creaked once, then stopped. Nothing else moved. The silence that followed pressed in so tightly that I felt it in my chest, a weight that made every breath feel like pulling air through water. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but something about the cabin kept me rooted. Curiosity and fear tangled in equal measure. I took a cautious step forward, my hand brushing against a blackened wall. The timber felt rough, scorched in some places, but intact in others. I noticed small scratches in the wood, faint like they had been made by someone, or something, scraping along the walls in desperation. My mind raced, imagining every explanation. Animals, vandals, the natural decay of wood. None of it made sense. The footsteps, the rocking chair, the scratches, they all felt deliberate, alive. Then I felt it, a sudden cold breath along the back of my neck, soft and chilling. I whipped around, heart hammering, but there was nothing. Just shadows pooling in the corners, moving slightly as if stirred by some invisible presence. My pulse jumped and I stumbled back, hand pressed to my chest, trying to steady my breathing. The cabin was silent again, but the feeling of being watched lingered, almost tangible, wrapping around me like a cloak. I didn't stay long. I moved back toward the door, but my eyes kept catching things in the shadows. Glints, flickers, movements that weren't there when I focused. Something about the way the cabin seemed to breathe, almost imperceptibly, made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I stepped onto the porch, letting the sunlight, or what little filtered through the trees, wash over me, but the unease didn't lift. That night, I dreamed of the cabin. I could see the blackened walls stretching higher than they should have, the upper floor intact and filled with whispers. I heard names, hundreds of them, soft and broken, carried through the timber as if the cabin itself remembered. Faces flickered in my mind, expressions twisted with fear and desperation, and I woke with my chest tight, heart racing. The air in my bedroom felt heavy, almost like the cabin's presence had followed me home. Weeks later, I mentioned the cabin to some locals, curious if they knew of it. Their faces fell immediately. One man shook his head slowly. "That cabin burned down decades ago," he said, voice low, almost reverent. "Nobody's seen it for years. Forests swallowed it long ago." My stomach turned. The man's tone made it clear he wasn't talking about a ruin. He meant it had disappeared entirely, as if it had never existed. I asked a few more people, and the story was the same. The cabin had been destroyed in a fire years ago, yet I had stood inside it, touched the walls, heard the rocking chair. I returned to the trail several times after that, drawn back by a mixture of disbelief and fascination. Each time, the forest seemed denser, the path harder to find. The cabin never appeared again. The rise where it had stood was just trees and brush, indistinguishable from the rest of the forest. But the memory of it never left me. The cold breath, the creaking chair, the steps above that shouldn't have existed. They stayed with me, etched into the fabric of my mind. I would catch myself imagining shadows in empty rooms, hearing faint footsteps behind me when no one was there. Sometimes, late at night, I hear it again in my dreams. The cabin's timber walls whispering names, recounting stories of those who vanished in the forest. And even in waking moments, when the wind shifts through the trees or a branch cracks underfoot, I feel it, the presence of that cabin, patient, waiting, timeless. I don't know how it exists, or why I was allowed to enter it. I only know that it did, and that it continues to exist in a way that defies reason. The memory of that day has changed me. I move through forests differently now, eyes alert to shadows and movements that might be nothing, or might be the echoes of a place that doesn't belong in this world. Sometimes I imagine the upper floor above me, still intact, filled with the whispering voices of those lost, the rocking chair swaying gently in the corner. I can feel their gaze even now, distant but patient, reminding me that some places in the Appalachians never truly vanish. They wait. They remember. And occasionally, they reach out to those foolish or curious enough to stumble across them. Even when I walk a familiar trail near my home, I sometimes pause at the sound of shifting leaves or a snap of a twig, imagining the cabin rising before me in the mist. I can feel the walls closing in, the rocking chair creaking again, and that faint, impossible cold brush against my neck. I will never go back. I can't. And yet, I know that somewhere in those forgotten forests, it waits. Timber blackened, roof sagging, filled with echoes of lives that vanished decades ago, but somehow impossibly still alive. I do not know if anyone else will ever see it. Maybe it is reserved for those who wander too far, who push curiosity beyond reason. But I know this, I was there. I felt the presence. I touched the walls. I heard the whispers. And I will carry that memory for the rest of my life. A constant reminder that some things in the Appalachians are patient enough to outlast fire, decay, and even time itself. That cabin, lost or hidden, waits, as it always has, as it always will. I had set out early that morning, hoping to catch the sunrise through the mountains, but the mist had rolled in heavier than I expected. The world seemed muted, the trees pale and ghostly through the fog, and even the creek I followed sounded different, softened and distant, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. My boots sank into the wet earth with every step, and I noticed that the trail I was following, if it could even be called a trail, twisted unpredictably, half erased by time and neglect. I had gone farther than I intended, but the thick white fog had a way of folding the landscape in on itself, making it impossible to tell how far I had come. That's when I saw it, a cabin perched on the bank of a creek I hadn't noticed before, the water curling around it like it had always belonged there. Its timbers were dark with damp, and the roof sagged slightly, as if weighed down by years of neglect. The morning light filtered through the mist in scattered silver beams, and the cabin seemed to glow faintly, like it was aware of my presence. Its door was ajar, creaking slowly in the soft current of fog that swept through the clearing. For reasons I can't explain, I felt drawn toward it, compelled by some subtle pull of curiosity, or maybe by something older and quieter in the air. I stepped onto the damp grass, the fog curling around my legs, and approached the door. Every step I took made the creek's water ripple faintly, though there was no wind, no movement beyond my own presence. The cabin smelled of wet wood, moss, and that peculiar tang of old smoke lingering in the timber, faint but unmistakable. I hesitated at the threshold, half expecting to hear a voice telling me to turn back. Instead, I heard only the slow creak of the door swinging in rhythm with the fog, like a heartbeat measured by the wind. Inside, the cabin was unexpectedly tidy, considering the age and wear of the building. Dust lay in thin layers across the floorboards, but I noticed a small pile of clothing neatly folded on a wooden bench in the corner. Nothing else was in the room. No furniture beyond the bench, no signs of life beyond the folded garments. The air felt dense, like it wanted to press against my lungs, yet I found myself moving closer to the pile, drawn by the simple act of order in an otherwise decaying space. I reached out instinctively, just to touch the edge of the folded clothes, when a ripple ran across the water outside. I froze. The creek was still just moments ago, and now the surface swirled violently, as though something beneath was moving with purpose. I stepped to the window, pressing my palm against the glass, but could see nothing in the fog. And then it came, a voice, soft and insistent, calling my name from across the creek. It wasn't loud, not piercing or harsh, just carrying a strange weight, like it had been waiting for me to arrive. My heart leapt. I spun, glancing at the creek through the fog, but there was no one there. No figure. Nothing. Just mist curling in slow waves over the water. The voice came again, and this time it was closer, clearer, though still distant enough that my rational mind told me I must be imagining it. Yet my instincts screamed otherwise. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I felt that creeping, hollow dread, the kind that makes you aware of unseen eyes pressing from all directions. I ran. My boots slipped in the mud at the edge of the clearing, and I fell forward, scraping my hands and knees, but the voice persisted, soft and melodic, calling my name, urging me to stop, to stay, to see something I could not comprehend. I scrambled upright and bolted through the fog, trying to orient myself by the creek, but the mist thickened, swallowing the cabin from view. For a moment, I thought I had imagined the whole encounter, the neatly folded clothes, the rippling water, the voice. But the scent of wet timber and moss lingered in my nostrils, grounding me in reality even as the fog consumed the clearing. I ran until the creek bent away from my path and the trail widened enough to see familiar trees, but the cabin never appeared again. I searched for it weeks later, retracing the path through the fog, walking in early mornings when the mist lay low and heavy, but the clearing was always empty. Just forest, water, and shadows where the fog curled in the slow morning light. Nothing suggested a building had ever been there. Nothing suggested that voice had ever called my name with such strange familiarity. The memory, however, never left me. On quiet mornings, when mist rises from the creek near my own home, I feel the weight of that presence again, faint and insistent, like a pull from across the water. Sometimes I think I can hear it whisper, soft and melodic, carrying across the hills, waiting. The folded clothes, the stillness, the rippling creek, they remain etched in my mind, as vivid as the day I first saw them. It wasn't fear that kept me from returning, exactly. It was something subtler, more corrosive. A certainty that the cabin was not simply gone, but waiting, patiently, deliberately. Waiting for the fog to roll in again, for the right morning, for someone curious enough to step into the clearing. And the voice, that persistent soft murmur, remains in my dreams. Sometimes I wake to the sound of my name carried by the wind, or the faint trickle of water curling in unnatural patterns, and I can't shake the sensation that the cabin is near, just beyond the veil of fog, still watching, still waiting, as it always has. I've told friends about it, though rarely. Most dismiss it as a dream, or fog-induced hallucination. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I know that somewhere along that creek, somewhere within the curling mist, the cabin exists, quietly, patiently, and that the voice will call again, always. Even now, years later, when the morning fog slips down the hills, I pause, listening for it. And every time I feel the same pull, the weight of expectation, the impossibility of turning back, the knowledge that some places in the Appalachian woods are patient enough to outlast reason, memory, and even time itself. I will never find the cabin again, I think. And yet, I carry it with me, alive in the memory of mist curling over water, in the echo of a voice calling my name from somewhere I cannot reach, in the quiet dread that settles on my chest whenever I near the creek. It exists somewhere still, waiting for those who wander too far, curious enough to hear its whisper, and I know, somehow, that it will always wait for me, too. I had been hiking along a ridge I'd only recently discovered, the kind of place that felt untouched by time. The trail narrowed quickly, slipping between dense stands of pine and oak, and the air was cooler here, damp with fog that had collected overnight. I loved mornings like that, the quiet hush of the mountains, the smell of wet leaves and earth pressed into every inhale. I followed the ridge further than I had intended, lost in the sound of my own boots crunching over moss and pine needles. Then I saw it, a cabin, small and weathered, tucked against the slope, almost hidden by the overgrowth. The timbers were gray with age, streaked with moss, and the roof sagged slightly as though the building itself were exhausted from decades of weather. The cabin drew me in a way that I can't explain. It wasn't a curiosity like most ruins I'd seen. It felt alive, in the subtle, almost imperceptible sense that the air around it carried memory. I approached slowly, pushing aside low-hanging branches, stepping carefully over roots slick with dew. The door was closed, but the wood was warped and dry. When I eased it open, it groaned under my touch, revealing the interior bathed in soft, diffuse light that had filtered through dusty, cobwebbed windows. Inside, the air smelled sharply of mildew and old wood. I could see the outline of a piano in the corner, its surface layered with dust, a thick gray blanket of years. The keys were yellowed, some chipped, but something about them felt strange. I bent slightly to examine them, and for a moment, the silence of the cabin was absolute. Then, faintly, a single note played. My head snapped up. I hadn't touched the keys. Another note followed, soft and tentative. Then a third. It was as if the piano were testing me, or perhaps warning me. My pulse quickened, but I stayed where I was, mesmerized by the sound. The notes didn't come in sequence. They were scattered, irregular, almost hesitant, like someone playing who had forgotten the tune. I could feel the shadows around me shifting, just beyond my direct line of sight. They moved in the corners, subtle swells of darkness that didn't belong to the room, lingering long after I turned my head. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, the effect of isolation in the forest, but the music persisted. There was intent in it, a presence behind the sound that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I circled the cabin slowly, noticing the small details, scratches along the floorboards, footprints pressed into the layer of dust that weren't mine, and a single chair pulled close to the piano as though someone had been sitting there recently. Nothing else moved, nothing breathed besides me, yet the feeling of not being alone was overwhelming. I stepped back toward the door, thinking I should leave, and that's when the melody became clearer, almost deliberate. It floated from the piano like smoke, curling around the beams, winding its way into the shadows. I could feel the vibrations in the floorboards, low and insistent, and suddenly it became impossible to ignore the cabin's weight. The music seemed to shift, forming chords that felt familiar but impossible. I couldn't remember ever hearing the tune, yet it tugged at memories deep in my chest, memories I didn't recognize as my own. I tried to step toward the keys again, but the shadows flared, filling the corners, and the air seemed colder, denser. The melody rose and fell with an unnatural rhythm, almost breathing, almost alive. I swallowed hard, sensing eyes on me, though I saw no one. The shadows seemed to lean forward slightly, subtle movements I caught only in the corner of my vision, disappearing whenever I tried to focus on them. I backed toward the door, my boots scraping the dust-covered floor, and the music shifted again, now playing in a higher register, delicate and haunting. It felt as if it were calling to me, coaxing me to linger, to understand, to join in some unspoken ritual. My rational mind screamed that I needed to leave, yet my body froze, anchored by fascination and terror combined. I turned abruptly to the piano, and the keys fell silent, though the shadows lingered, pressed against the corners, patient and watching. I bolted, stepping into the moist air outside, the cabin falling silent behind me, yet the sensation of being followed remained. The fog on the ridge seemed to thicken, curling around me as if trying to keep me close. I ran down the trail, branches tearing at my clothing, mud sliding under my boots, and all the while, the faint echo of the piano followed me. Not loud, but persistent, haunting, curling in my mind even as I left the ridge far behind. 4 days after, the melody lingered. I could hear it faintly in the quiet moments at home, drifting through my thoughts when I wasn't expecting it. The tune didn't follow any pattern I could recall, yet it was insistent, carrying the weight of someone, or something, long gone. Nights were worse. In my dreams, I returned to the cabin. Dust motes floated in beams of light, the shadows moved exactly as I remembered, and the piano played, coaxing me into the corners, pulling at the edges of my mind. I would wake with my chest tight, hands trembling, the tune still echoing faintly behind my eyelids. Curiosity compelled me to research the ridge, to see if anyone remembered the cabin. What I found unsettled me further. The records indicated that a man who once lived there had disappeared decades ago. He was a recluse, a musician who had rarely ventured into town, and the cabin had been abandoned and left to decay. Some locals whispered of hearing music drifting from the ridge on foggy mornings, though none dared to investigate. They told tales of hikers who wandered too close and returned shaken, claiming the piano played even when no one had touched it. My pulse would quicken every time I read those stories, feeling the uncanny echo of my own experience, realizing I had been part of something that had endured long before I arrived and would continue long after. I returned to the ridge once more, hoping to reconcile what I had experienced. The fog was thick, rolling in waves over the mountainside. I followed the trail cautiously, heart pounding with anticipation and dread. But the cabin was gone. The spot where it had stood was just trees, moss, and the slight rise in the earth that suggested a foundation long since collapsed. No piano, no shadows, no echo of melody. And yet, the tune remained in my mind, more vivid and haunting than ever. Every so often, when the wind rustles leaves or a branch cracks on a quiet ridge, I think I can hear it, the piano playing just beyond the edge of perception, the music curling in the fog as if waiting for me to return. The experience has changed the way I move through the forest. I am aware of every shadow, every shift of light, every whisper carried on the wind. I know that some places in the Appalachians are patient, keeping secrets that can endure decades, waiting for those curious enough to stumble across them. The cabin, the piano, the shadows, they were real. I know it. And the melody lingers, persistent, insistent, a reminder that some memories, some echoes, never leave. They wait quietly, waiting for the next person to listen, to hear the notes that call from the fog, from corners of a world we barely understand. Even now, years later, when I hike alone in the early morning fog, I sometimes pause, Sure, I can hear the piano in the distance. Soft, delicate, insistent. The melody wraps itself around the trees, around the ridge, around my thoughts, and for a moment, I feel the weight of that abandoned cabin, patient, watching, waiting. I know it is still there somewhere, as it has always been, and I know the shadows and the music will never truly leave me, lingering like a whisper that never fades, reminding me that some things in the Appalachian woods are not meant to be understood, only remembered and feared. I had been hiking through the heart of the mountains, a stretch of forest I had barely mapped in my mind. The trails were faint, overgrown with ferns and moss, twisting and looping in ways that made sense only to the forest itself. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves, and even the birds seemed reluctant to call out. I was alone, or at least I thought I was, and the solitude felt like a pressure pressing down from all directions. I followed a narrow ridge, the ground slick with fallen pine needles, when I first saw it. A cabin, blackened with age, partially hidden behind a stand of twisted oaks. The sight of it made me pause. It looked abandoned for decades, though its timbers were surprisingly intact. The roof sagged slightly, and the windows were dark, reflecting the pale light filtering through the canopy. Something about the place unsettled me immediately. I could feel the weight of it, like the forest itself had leaned away from this clearing, leaving the cabin isolated in silence. As I approached, I noticed the chains. Rusted iron chains, hanging from the ceiling beams in the open doorway, swinging slightly though there was no breeze. The smell of iron was strong in the air, metallic and tangy, curling my stomach in knots. I stepped onto the threshold, boots crunching over dry leaves and broken boards. The interior was darker than I expected, but the shapes of furniture, or what might have once been furniture, stood out in the gloom. The chains swung lazily, catching light in thin streaks, and I felt a tight knot of unease in my chest. I didn't want to be here. My instincts told me to turn back, but the pull of curiosity was stronger, and I crossed the floorboards carefully, trying to avoid the creaking patches that threatened to betray every step. It smelled of iron and mildew, old sweat and wood long forgotten. I noticed the markings first as shadows, then as lines scratched into the walls, crude, deliberate carvings that looked like letters, symbols, some possibly counting years or days. They were chaotic, overlapping in places, etched deep into the timber as if someone had labored over them for hours, or perhaps years. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Whoever had been here had left their mark, and yet there was no sign of life, no bedding, no remnants beyond the chains and the markings. It was as though someone had been tied here long ago, and then vanished without a trace. I moved further in, compelled to examine every detail, and that's when I heard it. A faint clatter like chains dragging across the floor behind me. My breath caught. I spun, but the room was empty, save for myself and the dangling chains overhead. I stepped backward, heart hammering, convinced it had to be some animal or a shift in the old wood. But the sound came again, closer this time, echoing around the room, impossible to pinpoint. My hands shook, and I realized I had been holding my breath. The cabin seemed to shift around me. The shadows deepened, stretching along the walls, crawling over the carvings, and I felt eyes on me, though I knew there was no one. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run from this place, but I felt anchored, frozen by a combination of fear and fascination. My eyes roamed over the floor and the chains, and then I saw it, a faint scrape across the boards, as though something had dragged itself just out of my line of sight. The sound of chains continued, uneven, clanging, almost whispering in the echoing space, though no movement accompanied it. I turned toward the doorway, intending to leave, but the chains seemed to respond, swinging in a rhythm I couldn't comprehend. My steps toward the exit felt measured, as though I were being observed, tested, weighed against some unseen standard. Every footfall made the chains clatter in response, though my boots never touched them. I stumbled forward, hand reaching for the doorframe, and the clanging stopped. For a moment there was only silence, so complete it pressed against my ears and my skull. Then a whisper of scraping along the walls, soft and deliberate, made me spin again. I ran. My boots skidded over broken boards, mud clinging to the edges of the floor, and I barely noticed the cuts on my palms from the splintered wood. The chains rattled behind me, louder now, echoing in the darkness of the cabin, bouncing off walls and ceiling beams in impossible directions. I didn't stop until I had burst through the doorway and was back in the open air. Heart pounding, lungs burning, sweat slick on my brow. The cabin stood there, silent and immovable, chains swaying gently in the weak sunlight, as though nothing had occurred at all. I didn't look back for fear of seeing more than I could handle. The forest around me seemed normal again, though the air still carried the faint tang of iron, lingering in my nostrils. I ran down the slope until I hit a clearer path, finally able to breathe again, though the clanging of chains echoed faintly in my mind, persistent and intrusive. Weeks later, I tried to research the cabin, asking local hikers and even a few older residents of nearby towns. One man frowned when I described it. "Chains?" he asked, voice low, wary. "That place burned years ago. Folks used to say someone kept a prisoner there long ago, but it hasn't been standing in decades." His words chilled me. I realized that what I had seen and felt, the chains, the carvings, the dragging sounds, couldn't have existed in a building that was supposedly gone. Yet the memory of it was too vivid, too grounded in touch and smell and sound. I could recall the rough texture of the chains, the metallic scent heavy in the damp air, the soft scraping against the walls. The experience has stayed with me. I wake some nights, heart hammering, hearing chains rattling faintly in the corner of my mind, dragging across boards that no longer exist. I have nightmares of the cabin, of shadows pressing in from all sides, and the markings on the walls crawling toward me like living things. Sometimes I dream of being tied to those chains myself, unable to move as the cabin exhales around me, patient and inexorable. I returned to the mountains once, drawn by morbid curiosity, following the trail I thought would lead me back. But the clearing was empty, trees and undergrowth thick, no cabin, no chains, no carved walls. Nothing. I walked the ridge until the sun dipped behind the mountains, and still I felt the presence, the memory of those chains, dragging along the floor behind me, waiting. I have not ventured back since, though part of me wants to, compelled by a mix of disbelief and fascination. The chains, the carvings, the dragging sound, they feel like they exist somewhere, outside of ordinary time, waiting for another visitor to witness them. The memory is etched too deeply to be erased. Even now, when I walk through old cabins or forest trails, I pause at the sound of a loose hinge or a shifting shadow, reminded of that place. The forest can hide impossible things, and sometimes, just sometimes, those things remain, patient, hidden, waiting for someone to notice the faint clatter of rusted chains in the darkness. I had been following a narrow trail along the edge of a ridge, early morning fog curling around the pines and oaks like smoke. The forest was quiet in that way only deep Appalachia can be. Soft, oppressive, as if the air itself were holding its breath. Birds called occasionally, brief and distant, and the trail beneath my boots felt uneven, overgrown, almost unwilling to be followed. I had been hiking for hours, alone as usual, and the solitude that normally brought peace now felt heavy, almost suffocating. That's when I saw the light. A small warm glow flickered through the mist, steady and strangely bright against the gray of dawn. I paused, scanning the trees, wondering what could be out here in the middle of nowhere. As I drew closer, I realized it was a cabin, small and weathered, with a single lantern burning inside. The light seemed alive, flickering gently as though it breathed. The flame danced without wind, casting long, wavering shadows through the windows. I felt a pull, a curiosity mixed with unease, and despite every instinct telling me to keep moving, I approached. The door was closed but not locked, warped slightly with age. When I eased it open, it groaned in protest. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with dust and the faint smell of old wood and lingering smoke. The lantern sat on a small table, its flame steady now, and the light illuminated walls covered in photographs. Hundreds of them. Faces of men, women, and children stared at me from yellowed paper and cracked frames. I didn't recognize any of them, and the more I looked, the more I felt eyes pressing into mine, judging, following every movement I made. I stepped inside cautiously, boots silent on the creaking floorboards. My gaze roamed the walls, scanning each photograph. Some faces were smiling, others solemn, and a few had expressions I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or resignation. The lantern flickered, and I thought I saw a movement in the corner of my eye, subtle and deliberate. I turned sharply, but there was nothing there. The cabin was empty except for me, and yet the weight of presence was undeniable. I could feel it in my chest, a heavy pressure, as though the people in the photographs were aware I was there. I moved closer to the table, reaching for the lantern, and the flame flared once, as if reacting to my touch. Then it settled again, steady and unwavering, throwing the room into a warm golden light. I could hear the floorboards groan beneath my weight, soft but insistent, like whispers in the silence. Something about the way the cabin was built, the way it held the light and shadows, made me uneasy. It was as though time itself had slowed inside, preserving the presence of those who had long since vanished. I wandered through the cabin slowly, taking in details I couldn't explain. A small chair tucked into a corner, a stack of papers that crumbled at the edges, a faint smell of candle wax lingering where no candles burned. And then I noticed it. Faint impressions in the dust on the floor, as though someone had paced back and forth while watching the photographs. My pulse quickened. I had seen no one, yet the evidence of another presence pressed in around me, tangible and oppressive. I bent to examine one of the photographs, a portrait of a man with dark, hollow eyes. The expression made my skin crawl. I could swear his gaze followed me, even as I turned to look at another. I stepped back and the lantern flickered violently, then dimmed slightly, though no wind had moved through the cabin. A shiver ran down my spine. I had the distinct feeling that I was no longer the one observing. Something was observing me. Something patient, waiting, silent. Then the flame went out. A sudden gust of cold wind, or perhaps something else, snuffed the lantern, plunging me into darkness. The photographs were gone from my sight, yet I could feel their presence. The weight of unseen eyes pressed in from all directions. Panic surged, and I stumbled backward, hands outstretched, searching for the door. The darkness seemed alive, curling around me, and for a moment I thought I would be trapped in that cabin forever, surrounded by silent witnesses. I found the doorway, yanking it open, and ran into the foggy morning air. The forest swallowed the cabin behind me. I didn't dare look back, though I felt a pull, a tug in my chest, urging me to return. My breath came in short gasps, and the fog seemed thicker than before, curling over the trail, wrapping around me like a living thing. I ran until the trees thinned, until I could see sunlight breaking through the mist, and only then did I slow, shaking, heart pounding, mind racing with questions I had no answers for. Weeks later, I returned to ask about the cabin. Locals shook their heads, eyes wary. "Lantern cabin," one man muttered. "That place burned decades ago. Been abandoned since before I was born. Folks say the old owner disappeared, just gone. Some say it wasn't ever meant to be found again." I felt a chill. The details matched exactly what I had seen: the cabin, the lantern, the photographs. But according to records and memory, the place had been empty for decades. How could I have experienced it? How could the air have carried the weight of those lives if they had long since vanished? The memory stayed with me. At home, I would see shadows in the corner of a room, hear faint creaks in the floorboards when no one was there. Sometimes I would wake, sure that the faint glow of a lantern was casting long shadows across the walls. And sometimes, in the foggy mornings, I swear I can hear the faint creak of the cabin door opening, the brush of unseen footsteps moving slowly across the forest floor. I've never returned to that ridge. I can't. The memory is enough, vivid and alive, etched into the quiet spaces of my mind. The lantern, the photographs, the sense of being watched, they exist beyond reason, outside of time. And yet, sometimes, when I walk through the early morning fog, I feel the weight of those eyes again, patient and quiet, waiting in some corner of the Appalachian forest, watching, judging, insisting that I remember. Even now, years later, I pause when a flicker of light dances in the fog or the wind shifts unnaturally through the trees. I know the cabin waits, patient, untouched by time, holding the weight of those long gone. And I know, in some quiet, terrible way, that the lantern will flicker again for the next curious soul who wanders too close, drawing them into the same oppressive awareness of eyes that never blink, of faces that never leave, and of a presence that waits silently, watching, judging, eternal. I had been exploring Hollow Ridge for hours, wandering along narrow trails that twisted through dense stands of pine and hemlock. The forest here felt ancient, untouched by roads or hikers, and the silence pressed against me, heavy and almost physical. Every step on the soft carpet of pine needles and fallen leaves made me acutely aware of the solitude, and even the birds seemed cautious, calling only in brief, tentative bursts. I was alone, as I usually was on these excursions, and the isolation that I normally relished now had an edge to it, sharp and insistent, as if the woods themselves were warning me to be careful. The cabin appeared suddenly, tucked into a shallow depression along the ridge, barely visible among the undergrowth. It was small and dilapidated, the wood blackened with age and streaked with moss. The roof sagged, one corner nearly kissing the ground, and the windows were dark, clouds of dust and grime masking the interior. It groaned under the faint pressure of the wind, or perhaps under its own weight, but the sound sent a shiver down my spine. Something about it felt alive, or at least aware, as though the building itself were observing me through its broken windows. I stepped onto the porch, careful not to disturb the loose boards. Each creak under my boots sounded impossibly loud in the quiet of the ridge. The door was closed but not locked. I pressed my hand to the warped wood and pushed it open slowly, the hinges protesting with a drawn-out screech. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of decaying timber and the faint tang of ash. The fireplace sat cold and empty, though the hearth seemed to have been used not too long ago, or at least it bore marks that suggested recent activity, though how recent I could not tell. My boots scattered fine dust across the floor, and the sound echoed through the cabin like footsteps in a hollow tomb. I noticed footprints immediately. They were faint, pressed into the thick layer of dust, leading from the doorway to a far corner of the cabin. The prints were small, perhaps someone had been kneeling, crawling, or dragging something along that path. The floor in that corner was worn smooth in an unnatural pattern, unlike the rest of the cabin, which retained its rough texture. I felt drawn to it, a compulsion I didn't understand, yet as I approached, a whisper rose in my mind. Not out loud, but insistent, clear, leave. My chest tightened, a mix of fear and excitement tangling in a way I could not separate. The cabin seemed to close in around me. Shadows pooled in the corners, deep and thick, unnaturally dark against the faint daylight spilling through broken windows. I could hear the timbers groan, shifting under the pressure of unseen weight. The footprints, the worn floor, the oppressive air, all suggested that someone had been here recently, though I saw no one. A chill ran through me, crawling along the back of my neck, and I realized I was holding my breath. I bent to examine the corner more closely, brushing away dust with the back of my hand. The smoothness of the floor beneath my fingers sent a shiver through me. The moment I touched it, I felt the sensation of eyes on me, the weight of unseen attention pressing down like the ridge itself had leaned over the cabin to watch. My instincts screamed to flee, yet I lingered, unable to pull myself away from the evidence of the past, from whatever had moved through this cabin before me. Then I heard it, a creak. The floorboard behind me groaned softly, slowly, but deliberately, as though someone or something was moving with careful attention, following my steps. My heart leapt into my throat. I spun around, scanning the room, but saw nothing. The cabin was empty, silent, except for the sound of its own wooden bones settling. I stepped backward, boots scraping the floorboards, and the creak came again, closer this time, echoing in the corners around the walls in the oppressive stillness. I bolted toward the door, lunging at the frame and pushing it open, but even as I crossed the threshold, the groaning followed. Every step I took down the ridge seemed accompanied by a phantom echo of floorboards beneath my boots, a sound that should not have existed beyond the cabin. The air outside was cooler, fresh, yet the sense of being watched clung to me, tangible and insistent. Weeks later, I returned to Hollow Ridge, hoping to rationalize the experience. The cabin was gone. The undergrowth had swallowed its outline completely, leaving only moss, roots, and the faint depression in the soil where its foundation had once rested. I scanned the ridge carefully, moving slowly, boots crunching over pine needles, but there was no trace. No worn floorboards, no footprints, no evidence that anyone, or anything had been here at all. And yet, in the silence, I could still hear it. Faint, almost imperceptible, the creak of a floorboard somewhere far beyond the ridge, patient and deliberate, as though it waited for me to return. The memory of that cabin has never left me. I wake some nights to the sound of floorboards creaking beneath invisible weight, to shadows pooling in corners of my room that stretch unnaturally as though alive. The ridge itself seems altered when I think of it, a place where the line between the present and the memory of what once existed is blurred. I can see the cabin clearly in my mind, the worn corner, the footprints, the oppressive quiet, the feeling of eyes pressing from every shadow. It is impossibly vivid, more real than anything else in those forests I have walked for years. Sometimes, when I hike alone in the early morning fog, I pause. The ridge seems silent, almost welcoming, and I am tempted to follow the paths I once took, to see if the cabin might reappear, to confront whatever it was that followed me that day. But I never do. There is a lingering sense that some spaces in the Appalachian forests are patient, waiting for curiosity to pull another visitor into their wait, their quiet, their memory. And I know that the cabin at Hollow Ridge still exists somewhere, outside of maps, beyond the reach of ordinary time, waiting silently for the next person to hear the subtle groan of timbers, the faint whisper in the dust, and the soft creak of floorboards in a place no longer visible, but very much alive. Even now, when I move through old, abandoned buildings or walk along forgotten trails, I catch myself pausing, heart quickened, waiting for the subtle sound of a floorboard shifting beneath a weight that isn't mine. I know the ridge waits, patient, quiet, and unchanged, holding on to that cabin and the memory of its presence in the dust and the shadows. And I know, in some deep, instinctive way, that the creaking will never truly leave me. I had been following a faint trail deep in the Appalachian forest, the kind that disappears into dense undergrowth and reappears unpredictably, worn only by deer or the occasional hiker braver, or more foolish than most. The forest was damp and quiet, the air thick with the smell of pine resin and rotting leaves. Every step was muffled by layers of needles and moss, and the silence pressed against me, tangible and almost suffocating. The kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every snap of a twig or rustle in the canopy above. After hiking for hours, I noticed it. Through the towering pines, a small cabin, partially hidden, almost swallowed by the forest itself. Its timbers were dark with age, soaked from long winters and endless rain. The roof sagged slightly, one corner dipping toward the forest floor, and the windows were clouded with dust and mildew. I felt a pull toward it, a curiosity mixed with unease, as though the cabin had been waiting for me. The air around it seemed different, heavier, the kind of silence that feels alive. I stepped cautiously into the clearing, my boots crunching on the undergrowth. The cabin smelled of wet wood and earth, the kind of scent that sticks to your clothes and hair. The door hung crooked, barely attached to its hinges, yet it creaked open easily under my hand. Inside, the floorboards groaned under my weight, thin and rotten in places, threatening to give way with every careful step. The interior was small, cluttered with the remnants of a life abandoned. A rocking chair sat in a corner, empty bowls on a low table, a threadbare blanket tossed over a stool. There were signs that someone or something had been here, recently enough for the air to feel disturbed, yet no one was present. The silence was oppressive, almost sentient, and I could feel eyes on me, though there was nothing visible to meet them. I moved slowly, examining the cabin. The bowls were chipped, the wood dark with age and moisture, yet each item had been left in place, almost deliberately. The rocking chair, in particular, drew my attention. It swayed slightly, though there was no breeze. My heart began to thump, heavy in my chest, and I forced myself to remember the basics. The forest is alive with its own noises, wind, and animals, and my mind tends to conjure shadows when I am alone too long. Still, something felt wrong. The forest outside the cabin was unnaturally quiet. No birds, no insects, no wind rustling through the pines. It was as if the woods themselves had stopped breathing, waiting. I could feel a tightness in my chest, a creeping fear that clawed its way from my stomach to my throat. I turned to leave, but paused, noticing a small set of footprints in the dust by the doorway. They were tiny, too small for an adult human, but distinct, pressed clearly into the floor. The cabin was supposed to be abandoned. I bent closer, examining them, but when I lifted my head, the footprints were gone. I stumbled backward, startled, and the rocking chair shifted again, the scrape of wood against floorboards faint but deliberate. I had the sensation of being watched, observed by something patient and silent, yet unseen. Panic surged through me, but so did fascination. I could not look away. Every instinct screamed for me to leave, to run back into the forest, yet my feet remained planted, glued to the cabin's rotting floor. The air grew colder, the dampness in the cabin turning to a chill that penetrated my clothes and settled deep into my bones. I could hear faint whispers, soft, almost melodic, but the words were incomprehensible. I strained to make sense of them, but they were not language. Just a sound that felt like a voice, lingering, patient, circling around me. I backed away toward the door, but the whispering followed, drifting closer with each hesitant step. Then I saw it, movement in the shadows, subtle and deliberate, just beyond the corner of my eye. I spun, but there was nothing. The cabin remained empty, yet the sense of being observed intensified, pressing down like the weight of the forest itself. I stumbled over a floorboard, the sound sharp in the oppressive quiet, and the rocking chair shifted violently in response. I snapped my gaze toward it, and for a fleeting second, it seemed as if the shadows themselves had lengthened, reaching toward me. I bolted, running from the cabin without looking back. The forest swallowed me in its damp, green embrace, the muffled crunch of my boots and my rapid breathing the only sounds breaking the unnatural silence. Even as I put distance between myself and the cabin, I felt it. Eyes following me, patient and cold. The weight of the forest seemed to linger in my mind, pressing in from all sides, and I did not stop running until I reached a familiar trail, sunlight breaking through the trees and shattering the oppressive gloom. Days later, I tried to rationalize what had happened. The cabin, the rocking chair, the footprints, the whispers. It could have been imagination, a trick of the isolation, fatigue, or the oppressive solitude of the forest. Yet the memory was vivid, too grounded in the senses to be dismissed. I remembered the damp smell of the wood, the chill in the air, the subtle shifting of shadows and the slight, deliberate sway of the chair. I could still feel the weight of those eyes, pressing from corners and walls, as if the cabin had not been abandoned at all, but merely waiting. Weeks passed, and I found myself drawn back to the ridge, compelled by something I could not name. I followed the trail to the clearing, but the cabin was gone. Moss and undergrowth had claimed its footprint, leaving no trace that it had ever existed. The forest was alive again, the air filled with the usual sounds, birds, insects, wind through branches, but the memory of the cabin remained, vivid, pressing, impossible to ignore. I tried to tell others, but no one had heard of a cabin beneath the pines in that part of the forest, at least not recently. I was left with my memory, and a lingering sense that the cabin still existed somewhere beyond reason, outside time, waiting for the next curious soul. Even now, years later, I notice subtle things in the forest. Faint shifts of shadow, a whisper of movement, the feeling of being observed when no one is around. The cabin beneath the pines exists in memory and in the spaces between what is seen and what is felt. I am not sure if it exists physically anymore, or if it is some echo of the forest's deeper patient awareness, but I know that the sensation of being watched, of something alive and quiet, waiting beneath the towering pines, will never leave me. The forest has a way of holding onto memories, of preserving moments, and sometimes it shares them with those who wander too far, too long, alone. I still see the rocking chair, hear the faint whispers, and feel the chill that penetrated my bones that day. I know the cabin waits, somewhere, patient, silent, its presence lingering in the spaces where shadows fall and the pines bend overhead. And I know, in that quiet, insistent way, that it is still watching, waiting, always waiting for someone to notice.